trying to defend Christian ethics, which may seem like a strange thing if you were wandering in here for the first time, but I think all of you have been in here through at least for some of the weeks that we've been doing this. And we all are aware that one of the main areas where the Christian faith is being attacked is, in fact, in the area of ethics. Whether it's accusations against us as individuals, like you're unloving, or it's accusations against Christianity more broadly, that, for instance, the church or Christians are, as we'll talk about tonight, opposed to women's rights or hateful toward the LGBTQ plus community, or whatever the case may be. Or it could be more theological, ethical objections, and we'll talk about that. The last thing we're going to talk about tonight is trying to answer the charge that a God that would send people to hell is evil. Now, we talked about that in our first week, where we connected our love to God's love to try to just better understand a biblical portrait of love. So we're going to circle back around to that if we don't run out of time. We're going to circle back around to that tonight. So these are the issues that we've looked at, 6 charges often leveled against us today: that Christians are unloving, we're hateful toward LGBTQ people, that we deny genuine gender identities. And then tonight we'll talk about this: Christians oppose women's rights. That's one of the charges leveled against at least conservative Christians. That the Bible endorses slavery and genocide. We talked about that last week. And then last, that a God who condemns people to hell is evil. And obviously I got out of order. So in all honesty, what I did last week is I just started preparing on what I thought was next and never looked. And I was a week ahead of myself. And so I thought, well, I've already prepared for it. We'll just take things out of order. No big deal. That happens. So tonight we're going to consider these 2 issues. First, this charge, and it relates primarily, obviously, to the issue of abortion, that Christians, conservative Christians, evangelical Christians, oppose the basic rights of women when it comes to this issue. And so that's the first thing that I want us to talk about: abortion and women's rights. And so where we really have to start there is with the biblical basis of all human rights. That's where we want to start. The biblical basis of all human rights, of course, is that we are made in God's image. What value do we have as human beings? Well, from a Christian worldview, from a biblical worldview, the value that we have is that we are uniquely created, unlike anything or anyone else in all of creation. We are created in the image of God. Now, when you talk to non-Christians about why human beings should have some sort of intrinsic value, you'll get various answers. Some will say that we don't have any value above other created things, that we have no more value than any other animal, or even some would say any other living thing, even including plants. And so you will get those sorts of answers, but the vast majority of people have a basic intuition that human lives are valuable. That if you're forced with the choice to choose between saving a dog and saving a child, you save the child. We know that by intuition. We know that because God has implanted that kind of basic moral knowledge within all of us. But that's all rooted in the reality that we are created in God's image. We don't necessarily have to prove the biblical basis to most non-Christians. Most non-Christians just understand that human beings have an intrinsic worth and value. But we need to know what the basis of that is. We need to not just know it by intuition. We need to know that on the basis of biblical teaching. And so this is where we start. That's the most fundamental thing. So that we can say that women and their unborn children possess the same rights as all other human beings. That's really important. We're not trying to elevate children above women or women above children. We're not trying to do either of those. We're trying to acknowledge that they are both human beings, and therefore they both possess the same basic rights as human beings. And the most basic of all human rights, of course, is life. That we have the right to live and to continue to live. And that requires us to do a little bit of thinking. It requires us to start thinking and trying to answer questions like, when and why is it okay to take a life? And then why is it not okay to take another human being's life. It's mainly not okay because we have this in Genesis chapter 9. Again, just for us, giving us a biblical basis of why life is the most basic right that we have. This is after the flood, God speaking to Noah as he's commissioning sort of a new humanity. And so this is binding upon all the descendants of Noah, which is all of us. He says, for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning from every beast. I will require it, and from man. From his fellow man I will require a reckoning for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. That there is this basic worth and value to human life such that if you take a human life unjustly, then you forfeited your own life. And then we want to move from that, though, and then start asking the question, okay, so if that's the case, when is killing not murder? Because there are situations in which a human life has to be taken or is taken, and we wouldn't automatically classify that as murder. We wouldn't automatically throw them into the class of those who've now forfeited their right to life by taking the life of another. And so there are three broad categories. We could sit and talk about these and debate about, what qualifies for each one and the circumstances and all those sorts of things, but we don't really have time to do that. But there are three circumstances in which, generally speaking, we would acknowledge it's not murder when you take another person's life. One is the context of war on the battlefield. Only those who have a really radicalized type of thinking would accuse every soldier who engages in battle of murder. We don't do that. In fact, soldiers are usually welcomed home as heroes, even though we know they've had to do very difficult things. They've had to take other lives. And then the second would be in self-defense. I think most of us would acknowledge that if you take someone's life, not because you want to, but because you're forced to, in self-defense, that we wouldn't call that murder. And then lastly, capital punishment, which ties back into the passage we read from Genesis 9. Who's going to mete out this punishment? If the person who murders another person, sheds the blood of another image bearer, if their life is then going to be taken, who's going to take that life? Well, in the Old Testament, it was usually a close relative. If you read through the law of Moses, for instance, there are various restrictions and limits placed upon this, but essentially, a near relative has the right to take the life of someone who kills their relative. And so a husband has the right to avenge his wife or his children. A brother the right to avenge the life of his own brother. So you have these various laws that are intended to slow that process down to make sure that you get due process and some sort of trial, so that if you are accused of murder, you're allowed to go to what's called a sanctuary city, and your life cannot be taken by that avenger. They have to wait. But if they catch you out in the field, well, you shouldn't have been out in the field. That's your fault. But that's under the Old Covenant. Of course, oftentimes under the Old Covenant, though, and the normal circumstances would have been that there still would have been a trial. And the whole point of going to the sanctuary city is to delay and put off the vengeance of a relative so that there can be a trial and evidence can be brought forward and all of those sorts of things. When you move into the New Testament, that duty is then given to human governments, secular governments. So that in Romans chapter 13, I didn't put this on the screen, but Romans chapter 13, Paul says that God has given the sword over to the government. And that assumes war, of course, but it also involves capital punishment, punishing those who do wrong. That includes capital punishment, but it's not limited to capital punishment. It's much broader than that. But if you're going to use the imagery of sword in the ancient world, it certainly includes all the way up to capital punishment. So there are instances, we have to acknowledge this, that when taking the life of another image bearer is not murder. These are the three instances. And so we have to look at the issue of abortion and ask ourselves the question, does it qualify under any of these? And that's not a difficult question to answer. The answer is no. It doesn't qualify. So, how would we go about carrying on a conversation with someone who wants to argue that, well, in some cases or in many cases, it's okay. How would we want to argue the worth and value of an unborn child such that they are put in the same position as a toddler or a 10-year-old or a 30-year-old? Like, that's what it really is. What it really comes down to is we have to help people, Christians and non-Christians, to see that an unborn baby is, in terms of worth, value, and dignity, is no different than anyone in any other category of life. Whether you're talking about an adult, a child, they're in the same category. And so we want to be able to address arguments that might be raised to sort of demote unborn children to something less than fully human, or less than deserving of all of the rights that we would give to anybody else. So that's really where the argument lies. We're not involved in complicated theological arguments. We're not having to convince them that humans have value because they're made in the image of God. That's a biblical argument. We're just relying upon, one, their intuition that human life is valuable, that it would be wrong of you to take their life. And then we've got to convince them that the unborn child is on the same level and deserves the same rights. And there have been a lot of different ways of arguing this, a lot of different things put forward, but what I have found over and over to be the most helpful is an argument called the SLED argument. Is anybody familiar with this? The SLED argument. It's an acronym. Okay, well, let me lay it out for you. So the SLED argument, S-L-E-D, can you guys see this? Or just, let me move this out of the way. So the SLED argument addresses a lot of the reasons for denying that the unborn have the same rights as any other human being. And the first has to do with size. Just simply the simple argument that the size of a human being does not determine their worth and value. Now, that seems almost obvious when we're thinking about, a toddler or a dwarf, right? Or, anybody else. Like when we think of size, we don't think the smaller a person is, the less value they have. We don't think in those terms. And yet, for some reason, you will hear people say, you're just talking about a clump of cells. They're so small, they're so tiny. How can they have that same worth and value? Well, the argument that you want to make is really simple, is that do you give less value to a 9-month-old than you would to a 9-year-old because of their size? No. So size cannot be used as an argument in favor of taking the life of an unborn child. And then really closely related to the issue of size is just level of development. Very similar argument. So they'll say, again, things like, well, you're just talking about a clump of cells, or they don't even have functioning organs yet, or whatever the case may be. All these different arguments put forth. But again, you have to carry the logic forward. Does an infant have less intrinsic value than an adult? Because they're at very different stages of development. The infant is a very early stage. Legs just dangle there. They don't even do anything, right? Their head's so big they can't even reach their hands over. Totally different, level of development. Are they of less worth and value? We all know the answer to that, no. They're not of less worth and value. So we want to extend that argument into the womb. And say, if you're going to argue on the basis of their level of development that their life can be taken, why can't you logically run that out? Why not? And then the E is environment. It's where they're located. So does a person's environment, does a person's location determine their worth and value? Inside the womb versus outside the womb. And why would it? There's no other situation in life where we would say a person's life is valued dependent upon where they are. I can't think of any, maybe you guys can, I can't think of any other situation in which we would make that argument. And yet the argument is often made that as long as they're in the womb, their lives can be taken. Why? That's just their environment. That's just where they are. And then the last, degree of dependency. Degree of dependency. We all know that up to a certain point, an unborn baby can't survive outside the womb. And so it's often argued that until a baby can survive on its own outside the womb, then it doesn't have all of the rights of other human beings. Or as long as a baby is completely dependent upon its mother for its survival, then it doesn't have all of the rights of another human being. But again, it's just a logical argument. It breaks down when you stretch it out beyond the womb. Because a 1-month-old is entirely dependent upon its parents. Entirely. It cannot survive on its own for any length of time at all. It's completely dependent, and yet we would not say that a 1-month-old baby has no value. Now, some cultures would say that. But we in the West who have a Christian heritage have this sense of no, there's value even there. But you can go back to the Roman Empire, the Romans, the Greeks. If an unborn child was born, then they would just put it out in the woods. Put it out by the side of the road. And just leave it. And whatever happens, happens. And what normally happened was it died of exposure or because of animals. Various things. That was not uncommon. In fact, by the time you get to the mid-2nd to early 3rd century, Christians had become sort of infamous for going out and finding those babies and bringing them in and taking care of them and raising them. That was unheard of. Nobody else would do that. So there have been cultures that would look at infants and say they don't have the same kind of value as someone else. But most of us wouldn't do that. Most of the people that you interact with and have discussions with and conversations with on the issue of abortion would not make that kind of argument at all. So why, if their total dependency as an infant doesn't detract from their value and their right to life, why would it do so in the womb? You can go to the other end of life. Or you can go to someone who's been injured and they're completely dependent upon others for their care. Is their life of less value? No. You don't have the right to take their life. If human life has an intrinsic worth and value, and we're going to argue that there are cases where it's okay to take that life, we need to think about why. And there are 3 instances that we've seen where, it's not murder, it's not immoral to do that. But those are not the reasons that are cited whenever you're talking to proponents of abortion. It's these issues: size, level of development, environment, degree of dependency. So what other reasons have you heard? Have you guys heard other arguments, other reasons that would not be covered by this that people might give in order to argue that it's okay to take the life of an unborn baby? Rape and incest, okay? Yeah. So with rape and incest, we can just simply ask the question again, push it outside the womb. That's all you have to do, really. And ask, if you meet a 3-year-old and you find out that they were the product of rape or incest, do you have the right to take their life? It still comes down to one of these issues. You're still making the argument that, well, in that case it's okay, but it has to be also, you have to have a secondary issue because you couldn't do it to a 3-year-old. So, but that's the most common thing that you hear. Yeah. In some circumstances, you could put that under a self-defense, I think, in some circumstances. In other words, you're faced with a choice between 2 lives. It's extremely rare, but you're faced with a choice between 2 lives, and you have to make a choice. I think that would be the best category to put that under. most of the time, it's very rare that we're actually faced with that kind of decision. Most of the time, when you hear about the life of the mother, what people normally have in mind is the psychological profile of the woman, or when they say life, they don't mean her physical life, they mean her plans for her life. But if we're really talking about, if you had, for instance, a situation where it was a difficult pregnancy and it came down to it, and in the course of birth or whatever, both cannot possibly survive, then you make a choice in that moment. And I would put that under self-defense, a kind of self-preservation when you're choosing between two lives. You can think of lots of situations, maybe in a case where someone has cancer and they're pregnant, or where they have some other debilitating disease or something. Or, you can think of all sorts of things. There are a lot of things that some people will put into this category that it's questionable whether it falls in this category. So, for instance, you can think of like an ectopic pregnancy. Okay? There's usually not a choice to be made there. Nobody's making a choice. The baby cannot survive, generally speaking. There have been exceptions to that. There are procedures that have been tried. I don't want to get into every little exception for everything, but the vast majority of the time, you're not dealing with a choice. I mean, the only choice you're dealing with is, do we try to save the life of the mother or let them both die? Because the baby cannot survive. So all of those I would lump under self-defense or self-preservation and those kinds of things. Anything else you guys can think of, Andrea? Yeah. I would say to do exactly what you did. Keep the baby alive as long as God desires the baby to be alive. And the baby might not make it to birth, but may make it through birth and survive for a while. Some babies have survived with that condition for some time. And then sometimes things have been misdiagnosed and everything's fine. That's pretty rare because we have pretty good imaging technology now. But it can happen. So I would say do what you guys did. Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and there's this assumption that a person with Down syndrome or some other mental disability is of less worth and value. Or that they are, because they cannot do all the things we do, they must not be as happy as we are. Some of us are pretty miserable. And I've not met a whole lot of miserable Down syndrome folks. I really haven't. So it's a bad argument, not based upon any evidence. So, yeah. Anything else? So I'm giving you this because it's easy to remember. Acronyms are generally pretty easy, just SLED. And I didn't come up with this. I think Scott Klusendorf, he has a book called The Case for Life. I think he may have been the one who originated this particular acronym. The arguments are not original to him. Lots of Christians have made these arguments over time. But I think he came up with this particular thing. So The Case for Life is the book that he wrote. It's not long. It's fairly short. He covers and answers a lot of questions in more detail than we have time for tonight. So it's a good one I'd recommend. All right. Okay. Yes, sure. Right. Yeah. We always need to aspire to be like those earliest Christians that I mentioned earlier, the ones who stepped in and took in the children. or those who often took care of women who were discarded. That was very common in the ancient world. Women were just discarded when it was found out that they might be a liability in some sort of way. And the earliest Christians were well known. They were ridiculed and mocked because of their morality, but they were well known for being willing to take them in and take care of them. I will say that when we hear people say, oh, you only care about the unborn, you don't care about the moms or the small children, I'll say that that's, again, an argument based upon in just ignoring all of the evidence. Orphanages, hospitals. Who starts those? There's no atheist organization starting hospitals or opening up orphanages. And when you look just throughout history, those things don't exist until the rise of Christianity. They don't exist. Yes, there are random doctors, if you want to call them that treat people. But the idea of having a dedicated place where there are trained professionals and you can bring your sick loved one and leave them there and they will feed them and care for them and try to get them back to health, that doesn't happen prior to the rise of Christianity. That's why when you have the story of the Good Samaritan, why it stands out as such a shocking story that a person would nurse a stranger to health or another person would pay for that and make sure that it happens. Because there's no hospital to take them to. So for people to argue and say, well, you only care about the unborn. You don't care about what happens to them once they're born. That's just not true. Christians throughout history have done more than anyone else to care for children and for women. That is the case. If you look at adoption statistics, the vast majority of adoptions that happen today are by Christians, because it's a part of our basic regard for the worth and value of all people. So there's always more to do, and on the local church level, we do need to make sure that we are reaching out, that we're paying attention, noticing, and that we're doing everything we can to help. But if you just look more broadly than just the individual local church, rather than just looking at our personal responsibility, and you look more broadly at what Christians have done and continue to do, that's just, to be charged with that is just not true at all. So. Yeah. Right. Yeah, better. Yeah. Yeah. There's a world of misinformation out there. And the very fact that we tend to be hesitant to want to, Jesus tells us not to let our right hand know what our left hand is doing. We are hesitant to let the world know the good that we're doing sometimes. Sometimes that, in certain circumstances, that can work against us when there's a kind of a PR battle going on. Sometimes we have to be willing to say, no, here are all the things we've done. We're not trying to brag or shout it from the rooftop, but if you're going to say that we're not doing anything, here's all the things we're doing. Yeah. 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 For sure. Any other observations or comments? It's a huge issue. And I just want you to be able to be equipped to just answer the basic questions. And to be able to say, no, that's not true. Or let's think through this logically. Let's just think it through. So. Mm-hmm. Right. How should Christians react to that? Like, what should we do in light of? Yeah. So I think what I would want to say is that our priority has to be caring for those in need. That has to be our priority. Above and beyond national concerns, and those are the concerns of the government. But for us as churches and individuals, if we see a need, we meet a need. And so if we see a child or a family in need, regardless of their status or how we feel about how they came to be in a place of need, we still meet the needs. That's what we should do as a church. And then let the government deal with the issues of who can stay and who can go. But as long as they're here on our doorstep, we care for them. That would be my suggestion. So, I mean, you do have to think, when you vote, you have to think of larger issues like, it can be that there are policies in place that are creating these situations of need, right? And so you want to deal with policies that create needs that wouldn't otherwise be there, problems that wouldn't otherwise be there. So you want to think about those things. But when it just comes to our personal responsibility as a church, as an individual, we see a need, we try to meet the need. That's it. Yeah. What would you, yeah. Well, if we were, let's say that if we were a church near the border, right? We would want to make sure that we're volunteering at places that care for children and especially young mothers who end up stranded and things. We want to do that regardless of politics. Look, I assume our politics are kind of clustered a little bit, but we're going to have varying views among us even in our local church on things. Setting all that aside, if that need is right in front of us, we meet it. And then you deal with the political stuff separately. People are going to vote the way that they vote, and okay. But we're talking about people. We just care for people. We just love people, and we do what we can to meet their needs. So if we were in any sort of situation where we had this massive need right in front of us, and because of our political convictions, we turned away from meeting those needs, I just can't see Jesus tolerating that. I can't see it. I don't think that Jesus approved of the presence of the Romans in Israel or approved of their tactics, but he also didn't approve of the zealots who wanted to kill them and attack them and push them out. So we want to meet the needs and then let the politics sort itself out. Yeah, he agrees? Okay. Those are hard questions, and you're balancing convictions. You're balancing various convictions. But just keep love at the top of that. Okay, we have 12 minutes to deal with one of the biggest issues of all. And that is this charge that a God who would send people to hell is an evil God. That's the charge. Now, most of the time, when most Christians are asked this question, they will immediately move to what's known as the free will defense. That, well, all the evil that we see around us and God's response to evil is all because of human freedom. And that human freedom is of such worth and value that it was worth the risk for God to create a world where people would sin and he would have to respond by punishing that sin. It was worth the risk because that's the value, that's the worth of human freedom. I'm not going to make that argument. I don't think it's biblical, but I also think that it's going to fall short eventually. Instead, I don't want to root our understanding of what's good and right and true and loving in anything about us. I want to root all that in the nature of God, who God is. So that's why I have up here the Trinity and eternal punishment. If we're going to understand the nature of love and God's response to sin, then we have to understand something about who God is. And that takes us back to the Trinity. It takes us back to the doctrine of the Trinity. The first thing that we need to know, and this is all stuff that I talked about the very first week of our study. But the first thing that we need to know is that God's love is not to be defined first and foremost in terms of his attitude or actions toward creation. So let me say that again. God's love is not to be, first and foremost, to be understood or defined in terms of his attitude or actions toward creation, and that includes us. When John says God is love, that's a statement that was true about God before he ever created human beings. So, we cannot define God's love or have all of our understanding of God's love in relation to us. Does he love us? Yes, absolutely. But does God's love begin with us? Is it defined by his attitude and actions toward us? No. God's love begins in God. The Father, the Son, and the Spirit. Before God ever created human beings, perfect love already existed between the persons of the Trinity. Let me see, I don't even know what the slide has next, but okay, that's where we are, understanding the love of God. So let me just give you a glimpse of this, okay? John chapter 17. Does anybody know what John chapter 17 is? What's going on there in John 17? It's usually called the high priestly prayer of Jesus. This is Jesus before his arrest and trial and crucifixion. This is Jesus praying to God the Father. We can't go through all of it, but I do want to read you just a couple of things. I'm going to jump in at verse 24. So Jesus is praying on behalf of his disciples, and he extends that to everyone who would believe through their preaching. He says, Father, I desire that they also, whom you have given me, may be with me where I am, to see my glory that you have given me. Now note this phrase, because you loved me before the foundation of the world. Jesus, in praying to the Father, says, you loved me before the foundation of the world. Before anything was ever created, before human beings or anything else existed, the Father loved the Son. And the Son, in turn, loved the Father. God's love is to be defined in terms of his love for himself, or the love of the Father for the Son, and vice versa. That's where we root and understand and define the love of God. Which means that God's love for himself has to come before all else. Another way to say that is to say that above all else, God seeks his own glory above everything else. This is why we read in Isaiah, God says, I will not give my glory to another. God doesn't share his glory. So God values supremely above all else his own glory. Now that fits with what I'm saying about the love of God between the Father and the Son. The writer of Hebrews says that Jesus is the radiance of God's glory and the exact imprint of his being. So for God to value the worth of his glory is for the Father to love the Son. So when we talk about the righteousness of God, we want to make sure that we're relating God's righteousness, so right and wrong, what is good and right for God to do. We want to make sure that we are relating that back to what we call an intra-Trinitarian love. Okay? All right. So the righteousness of God is at its most base level. We could say more than this, but at its most basic level, the righteousness of God is his commitment to uphold and display his own glory. That's what his righteousness is. So if God were to do anything that did not uphold his own glory, he would cease to be righteous. Sometimes we talk about this in terms of holiness. Why doesn't God just ignore sins? Because that would make him unholy, and we know he's holy, okay? I'm just talking about it in relation to the term righteous. Because if you're going to charge God with doing evil, then you're in the realm of moral argument. You're talking about righteousness and evil, good and bad. That's what we're talking about. So God's righteousness is his commitment to uphold and display or preserve his own glory. That's what his righteousness is. So everything that we're saying is really God-centered. God's love is God's love for God, Father's love for the Son. God's righteousness is God's commitment to uphold his own glory. That is, the shining forth of his radiance in the person of his Son. This is all very God-centered way of approaching these things. So this is not like the free will defense that we normally hear. I'm not starting with us or something in us or something given to us that is of such great value that it's worth sin and the punishment that follows sin. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying ultimately everything's rooted in who God is. Which one? His righteousness is his commitment to uphold and display his own glory. Yeah, that's what his righteousness is. So then that takes us to the issue of sin, which is going to carry us toward hell, toward eternal punishment. Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. What Paul is not saying, he's not describing two different things that we have done. He's not saying people have sinned and then in addition to that, they fell short of God's glory. When you read that verse in the context of the first 3 chapters of Romans, it becomes pretty clear that what Paul is doing is he's telling us what sin is. Sin is refusing to give God the glory that he deserves. Sin is falling short of the mark of God's glory in all that we do. That's what it is. So in Romans chapter 1, he talks about the sinfulness of humanity in a number of ways. He says they refused to worship the Creator. They did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. In all of his explanations of what sin is, in Romans chapter 1, he carries it back to honoring God, worshiping God. Okay? So when we get to Romans 3:23, and he's summarizing everything, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, he's helping us to see sin is falling short of giving God the glory he deserves. That's what it is. Okay, so if the thing that God values, if the thing that is of supreme worth and value to God is his own glory, that is the shining forth of his beauty in the face of his Son, that's what we're attacking when we sin. If that's supreme worth and value, and sin is a belittling of that which is of supreme worth and value, how do you expect a righteous God to respond? Any response that falls short of an infinite punishment for an infinite evil would betray some degree of unrighteousness in God. Does that make sense? Do I need to say that again? I don't know if I can. Any response to an infinite evil that falls short of an infinite punishment would show some sort of degree of unrighteousness in God. Yeah. Yeah, a good illustration would be, you could compare things. A comparative illustration would be if you have 2 murders, okay? One murder is a man kills an innocent little girl for no reason whatsoever, just kills her. And he's on trial. The other one is another man kills a man because that man had abused hundreds and hundreds of children. Which one gets the death penalty most likely? The first one. Because the worth and value of the person offended determines the degree of the punishment. The innocent little girl is of greater worth and value relatively than this murderous abuser. Follow me? Okay. What if you've offended someone who is of infinite value? Infinitely evil. And there can be no punishment that meets that crime. It's not an infinite punishment. So there are only two ways this can go. An individual capable of receiving infinite punishment and then surviving can do the work for you. Or you can take an infinite punishment upon yourself, but because you're finite, you're limited, you're not infinite, it will never end. It'll never end. It cannot end. If it ends, it's not enough because it has to be infinite. You need a person of infinite capacity to absorb infinite wrath, or you need eternal punishment. And we have both. We have both. Either your sin is punished in Christ, the God-man, who can endure it, or you suffer for eternity for your sin. It is not evil for God to punish people in hell. His own righteousness demands it. It demands it. Those are not arguments that I assume you will be able to convince your non-Christian friends of. I don't assume that. But we want to make sure when we enter into these conversations that we don't give everything away by offering a weak defense. They're going to deny almost every aspect of that defense. They don't believe in the Trinity. It falls apart there. Okay, that's fine. But I'm just trying to explain to you what you're accusing me of having an evil belief. I'm explaining to you why my belief within my belief system is not evil. That's all I'm trying to do. That's what I'm explaining. Given the Christian worldview, it's not just not evil for God to send people to hell, it's righteous and a display of his love for him to do so. So I just want to equip you to be able to think through those kinds of things. Those are complicated arguments. I get it. I don't expect all of us to be able to sit down and have that conversation with someone. But it needs to be rattling around somewhere in your brain so that when you hear the accusation, you know there's an answer. Better than, well, God so valued our freedom that he was willing to risk it all. Yes. Yeah. Yes, but even that is ultimately rooted in a love for someone outside of ourselves. We punish them to make them better, right? When we punish our kids, it's discipline. When God disciplines his children, it's discipline, but when he sends someone to hell, that's not discipline. Yeah, it is different. So, I had this discussion a long time ago when I was in seminary and Allie was in law school. We had this discussion. Did we end up having a meeting where I talked to some of the law students about it? There was a professor that didn't want to engage in that or something. Yeah. Where we kind of got into this issue of retributive justice versus restorative justice, where restorative justice aims to improve the person being disciplined, punished, and retributive justice says, no, a wrong has been done, and they deserve punishment. And I think the professor had written a paper or done something to say that all justice should be restorative. And I said, well, the name of the school was Texas Wesleyan, so I said, this is Christian. No. Ultimately, from God's perspective, it's retributive. There's a place for restorative justice, God towards his people, us toward our children, and even at times the government towards its citizens. Sure. But all justice has to be restorative? No. And so when we look at hell, it's retributive, retribution, setting things right. So that's why I think the analogy doesn't quite work. All right, we're 5 minutes over. Any other comments or questions? So we have the next 3 weeks off, next 3 Wednesdays. When we come back, we're going to change up the way that we do things a little bit. We haven't yet decided if we're going to change our physical setup, okay? But instead of having the prayer time, we're going to meet and we're going to bring the kids in here as well at the beginning. We're going to sing a couple of songs. And then we'll pray and we'll dismiss into our different Bible studies. We're going to just kind of change things up a little bit, try to bring everybody together for 5 or 10 minutes at the beginning. And then that'll allow us to emphasize our separate prayer times. And it'll allow, when we have first-time guests come in on Wednesday nights, sometimes it can be a little bit awkward for them when we're all sharing prayer requests and we kind of know what we're talking about back and forth. So we're going to try to alleviate that and then bring everybody together for a few minutes. So we'll have some changes when we start gathering again on Wednesday. But our Bible study time, what we did just now the last few minutes, will essentially be the same. But just kind of heads up, know that some changes are coming. Okay? All right, let me close this in prayer. God, I thank you for letting us get together tonight. And I pray that over these next few weeks, as we're not meeting on Wednesday nights together, that you would draw us together every other opportunity that we have, especially for worship together on Sundays. Bring us back together for our special gatherings as well this time of year so that we remain closely connected with one another. And I pray that the extra time that we have, we would use it well, spending time with family, spending time with friends. We ask these things in Jesus' name.